It's just so great to be able to welcome you and to have you all here for what I think is going to be a pretty special hour. And I know what a busy, busy time this is for everybody. And so the fact that you took time out of your busy schedule to be here and welcome Jordan to our campus and to hear the kinds of stories he has to tell about the important work that he is doing is just great. I'd like to begin by thanking Sustainability Solutions Initiative for all the work that people are doing. David Hart, who is the leader, is standing in the back. And SSI provided the funding and is doing a lot of just really, really important work in terms of helping us think about collaborations across important issues. And one of the interesting challenges that we face as we do this work together is that there are lots of struggles. There are lots of ways that it's not quite as easy as we expect to do engaged research, to do it internationally, to do it locally, and so we need guides who really will help us think about these things. And Dr. Karubian is just a really great example of somebody who's learning and building a path. And I got to know a little bit about his work a year ago when I was on a committee that was selecting the faculty member in the country who's early in his or her career, who's doing the most innovative, engaged research. And he was the recipient. My understanding from talking to the other judges is it wasn't close. And he is a faculty member at Tulane University. And as you saw from the title, he's going to help us think a little bit about how you do this work and how he has been doing the work in Ecuador in a conservation hotspot. I think we're in for a lot of interesting opportunities to learn. We will have time for questions and a little time even afterwards if you have some questions. So with that, welcome to the University of Maine, and we're so pleased to have you here. Sign-up sheet because not everybody got to sign it, and NSF likes to know how many people get here. So
NSF or NSA?
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Linda, and thanks to all of you again for making time in your busy schedules to come out. I've been here for a little less than 24 hours, but I've already really been blown away by the depth and diversity of socially innovative programs that are happening here. It seems like a very exciting place to be, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about my work and then also continuing to find out more about what's happening here. So I want to start by talking about our universities, which is something that we're all obviously familiar with. And I would propose that the universities that we enjoy in the U.S. and in other parts of the world today, I think are really one of the great and outstanding cultural achievements that we've managed to put together. I mean, where else can you find such a concentration of knowledge? And at the same time, where else can you find such a concentration of young individuals who are who have tremendous amounts of energy and desire to affect change and to take that knowledge and use it in the world. And yet, at the same time, despite the great promise that we have in our universities, I would also argue that as a whole, universities are underperforming in terms of, specifically in terms of addressing social challenges that face our world today. And one particular issue where I feel like universities have particularly failed or are failing compared to what potential they have is in the realm of the environment. Environmental issues, as we all know, are rampant in today's world. And yet when you think about efforts that are being made to change those, universities are very rarely in a leadership role at the global level. And oftentimes, universities are not even sitting at the table in terms of actors or groups who are working to resolve those issues. And talking a little bit more about environmental issues, I'm sure everybody in this room is aware. We've surpassed 7 billion individuals on the planet. The population's still growing. That's putting pressure on our shared environment, which is resulting in losses of biodiversity, losses of habitat, and also in associated human health and well-being being compromised. And the thesis that I want to argue today, and I realize that this is not, for many of you, not going to be a novel thesis, but is that universities have a opportunity to really increase the breadth and the depth of positive impact that they're having on this environmental crisis, specifically by increasing and strengthening community-based partnerships. And to my mind at least, the reasoning, the logic goes a little bit like this, that we all know that local residents shape the environments that they live in through their actions and through their attitudes. And that's true everywhere, but it's particularly true in the developing world, I think, where oftentimes environmental regulations and enforcement of those regulations are lax or non-existent. And for that reason, I think that there's two important points that can be made about promoting engagement and community-based partnerships. The first is that it can help to protect the environment and through ways that we'll explore a little bit later in this talk, and through ways that everyone here is, I'm sure, familiar with to some degree. But also, second of all, I believe that community-based partnerships can actually improve the quality and the quantity of the science that's actually done through the university. So I think there's two compelling reasons to engage in community-based partnerships as we try to engage with these problems. And what I'm going to do for the bulk of this talk is present you with my own personal experience, a case study, if you will, from the time that I've spent in Ecuador trying to do just this. And then at the end of the talk, I'll try to broaden it out a little bit more to address some themes that are a little bit broader. And my goal is to leave enough time to have some question and answer, some dialogue. But certainly, if you guys have any questions during the if you guys have any questions during the talk, please feel free to jump right in. Okay. So this story starts in 2001, when I had recently completed a PhD. And I did my thesis research on social behavior, sexual selection, mating system of small birds called fairy wrens that live in northern Australia. And they're a common species, and they're widespread, and there really weren't a lot of conservation implications to the work that I did. In fact, really, there was really none. And I found that to be, I was unhappy about that. I wanted there to be, I wanted to have a bigger impact in terms of real world impact on what I was doing. And I was fortunate to join forces at that time with a professor from UCLA named Tom Smith, who provided me with a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship to travel down to Ecuador with the specific goal of serving as a bridge between university research and on-the-ground conservation efforts. And so I went down to Ecuador. I traveled around quite a bit, and there was one place that I went called the Chocó, which is in northwest Ecuador, that I just absolutely fell in love with. Beautiful forests, amazing species. We'll get to see a few pictures of them throughout this talk. And also a compelling place to do research because it's a conservation hotspot. So I decided for those reasons, really for more than anything, to be honest, because of a personal passion and connection that I felt with the place, but also these other more pragmatic reasons in terms of it being a biodiversity hotspot, to start working there. So a little bit about the Chocó. First of all, I'm always curious to ask this question, and Linda, you better raise your hand when I ask it. Who here has heard of the Chocó before? Okay, great. That's actually, I would say that's maybe 15% of the people here. It was actually a really high percentage. People, generally speaking, have not heard about the Chocó, but I hope that you'll be convinced by the end of this talk that it is a place that should be on your radar screens, especially those of you who work with environmental issues. It's a super humid rainforest type that extends from southern Panama extends. So it extends from southern Panama down the western coast of Colombia and into northwest Ecuador. It's on the western side of the Andes. It's sort of sandwiched there, a narrow, thin strip between the Andes Cordillera and the Pacific Ocean. And it has the most humid places in terms of precipitation on the planet. There's areas that get over 8 meters of rain per year on average. That's more than 25 feet of rain per year. It's wet. And it's because of geography and past history. It's also isolated, and as a result, there's been extremely high levels of biodiversity, extremely high levels of endemism, which means a species that occurs there and nowhere else that occur in this area. So, as a consequence, it's identified as a conservation hotspot by Conservation International, and it's also under extreme levels of threat by a relatively high population, especially in Ecuador, that lacks sustainable alternatives to extractive processes, which are not sustainable in the long term. And here's just a smattering of the, I couldn't resist to put in a few pictures of the organisms that live there. These are just some organisms you might see on a walk through the forest there on an average day. Really a spectacular place to work. And so, as I mentioned before, I arrived there fresh out of my PhD with good intentions to make conservation happen. And I soon focused on this species shown there, the long-wattled umbrella bird, which is really a spectacular species of bird, which is endemic to those forest types. It's in danger of extinction because it depends upon primary rainforest, and as that rainforest gets lost, so do those populations decline. And it also plays an ecologically important role. It is one of the few birds that's big enough to eat large seeds, so seeds of trees in the palm family or the avocado family. It ingests these seeds, and then it flies somewhere else and regurgitates the seeds later on, and by doing that it disperses the seeds around, which is an ecologically critical function that it plays for the maintenance and regeneration of these forests. So it seemed like a great species to start studying. It was also basically unknown. Nobody had really studied it in a serious way beforehand, so I was all excited, and I started working on it using the model that I'd used for my PhD, which was, I was working out of a field station, and I advertised for recent graduates from US universities, and I had a group of 5 or 6 US or Canadian field assistants who came down with me, and we conducted research on this bird. And the plan was to find out what are its habitat requirements, what is its home range size, what does it need in order to have its continued survival, to publish that in peer-reviewed journals, to disseminate results through talks and scientific conferences. That was sort of my plan. And I label that an extractive model. I'm not the only one to label it that way, but I think it's a term that fits. What I mean by that is it's a model in which researchers come into an area and extract knowledge from that area, and then go disseminate that knowledge in another venue. It's really, I think, although it's changing, at least in my field, it's a very traditional and typical model, where the local residents don't really understand what it is you're doing, they don't really see the results of what it is you've done, you just kind of come in there for however long, and then you're gone. And to contextualize where I was doing the research, I was doing the research in a federal reserve called the Machichindul Reserve, which is a relatively large reserve in northwestern Ecuador that in 1992 was declared an absolute reserve by the outgoing president. And if you look on the books, what that means is that for a human being to enter this reserve, you need to have written permission from the government to be able to go in there. The reality of the situation was that at the time that the reserve was established, there were several thousand people living in the reserve who had already lived in the reserve for, in some cases, generations. So this is a classic example of a paper park. If you look at what it says on paper, you get one image, and when you actually go look at it in reality, there's a completely different reality where this relatively large reserve has right now a staff of 6 people that try to manage it and enforce environmental regulations. And this gets back to what I was talking about in developing countries in particular, the importance of local residents in terms of determining how things are going to play out environmentally. There's de facto, it's the attitudes and actions of these local residents that are going to determine what happens. And where we work, there's people of mestizo descent, which means European ancestry mixed with indigenous peoples. And then there's a few clusters of straight-up indigenous communities, and also a few communities that are Afro-Ecuadorian, people of African descent who've lived in the area for several hundred years. And these people are organized in small communities between 10 and 50 families that each family has a small finca or farm where they have some forest remaining on their farm, and then the other areas are under cultivation. And they have loose associations within these communities, but they do elect local leaders and have some form of organization at the community level. And the communities are interspersed in a mosaic that has patches of rainforest in between them. And also in this area is a privately owned reserve called the Bilsa Reserve that has a large chunk of good forest. So you have an area with a large government reserve that you wouldn't really even be able to tell when you went from inside or outside the government reserve. There's really little indication, although that is slowly changing. And then you have these communities of relatively small communities interdigitated with forest within the reserve. And the people who live in this area, in these communities, really lack basic services from the government. A lot of things that we take for granted, like water, education, electricity, they don't have. In terms of education, there's one-room schoolhouses that have kids between the age of 5 and 15 clustered together with one overwhelmed teacher, oftentimes trying to handle that situation. And like I said, there's no electricity in most of these communities. There's no running water, there's no sanitation. There is a sub-center of health that individuals can get to, but that services 15 or 20 communities, and individuals have to walk, anywhere between 1 and 6 hours to get there. And there is limited economy in this area. The main cash crop in the area is, does anybody know what this crop is? Cacao. Very good. This is cacao. They make chocolate out of the seeds that occur inside of these pods, and they have very high quality cacao that they develop in this area, but they have tremendous difficulties getting it to market because of high rainfall, muddy roads that are oftentimes, most of the time, impassable to vehicles. So most of the families that live there are basically on a subsistence economy where they're growing crops and they have livestock that they use to put food on their own table with relatively little cash economy. And as a result, this leads to deforestation and to hunting are the two main environmental challenges in this area. Again, it's oftentimes what it ends up being is individual household level decisions to cut down a patch of forest in order to plant corn or to plant beans or plant rice, really in order to put food on the table, and similarly with the hunting. And so that's the backdrop that this research effort that I was starting up was occurring with it. And it was sort of gradually over the course of several months as I was going in and out of my study site. I was becoming aware of this and realizing that the model that I was employing might be untenable. But it really took a pretty dramatic incident to knock that home to me in a very visceral kind of way. And that happened when I was walking down the road one day, the trail one day, and I came across this anteater shown there in the top picture. And anteaters are a pretty common animal in this area, and they're not a crop pest. They're not aggressive. They don't do anything that I've ever heard of that's negative or harmful to human beings. But somebody or some group of people had come across this poor animal and had gone at it with a machete, and just in a real wanton act of cruelty, had just cut it several times in its head, its neck, its back, and it was, in a really pitiful kind of way, just struck. It was obviously going to die, but it wasn't dead yet. It was going to have an comfortable last few hours, and it was just trying to make it across the road. And I looked at that, and I was obviously, well, not obviously, but I was struck by the cruelty of that act and how unfortunate it was. And just then, a young boy, about a 12-year-old boy, who I knew his family, and I held him in high regard. He was smart, he was bright, he was interested. He was one of those kids who always comes up and asks you good questions and was enthusiastic and tags along just because he's interested. And I looked and I said, look at this, isn't this terrible what happened here? And he looked at me as if I was from outer space. Like there was no sort of comprehension or shared sentiment that what had happened to that animal was maybe not right, not good. And it was at that moment that I realized, in a very sort of like got hit over the head with it, that I could do all the research I wanted on the umbrella birds. I could publish it in the top journals in the world, and it really just wouldn't matter at all in terms of conservation in this area. That to be able to affect conservation in this area, it was really important to make connections with the local residents. And I always put this slide up at this point to just underline this fact that, so this is an area where deforestation is happening, high rates of deforestation. It's an area where hunting is happening. It's an area where acts of cruelty, what we would consider acts of cruelty towards animals, are happening. There's a pet trade, and yet at the same time, the individuals who are carrying out these activities, they're not bad people. They're amazing people who are warm and loving and intelligent and caring, and it's a complex combination of factors that's driving these activities. But at the same time, I found this situation to be a much more tractable situation than, say, trying to deal with multinational corporations and global level economic forces, even though those do impact this area in some ways. So with that context, I want to, what happened, and this is something that evolved organically over time, and it's still continuing to evolve. And I'm not really going to focus on sort of the step-by-step evolution of it. I'm just going to kind of give you guys a picture of what it looks like now, 10 years down the road, from when I had that realization that we need to work with local individuals. I'll say that the first thing that I did is asked around, and we started to hire local individuals as full-time researchers. So we gradually replaced, students from the U.S. and foreigners with local residents as researchers, and then it just sort of continued to expand out there from there to become a community-based approach to conservation and scholarship that is really based on two fundamental core elements. The first is conducting top-level scientific research. I am a scientist, and research is what I do. But also that research that fundamentally includes local residents at nearly every level of the process, from design to implementation to dissemination, and other aspects as well. And right now we view four different sort of components of what we do out there. The first is training. The second is education. The third is economically viable alternatives. And the fourth is research. And I want to talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. So the team that we have in Ecuador now, like I mentioned, it started out hiring local residents. And we have a complex team. We've been doing this for over 10 years now. And the composition of the team that we've assembled has changed over time. But it's composed of local residents, some of whom have worked on the project for more than 10 years. Ecuadorian university students who we bring on the project to do honors theses for a year or more. Ecuadorian professionals, international researchers like myself, funding sources, because all the work that we do depends entirely upon obtaining funding, and strategic partners like universities and museums and other non-for-profit groups, etc. And the first aspect of what we do, and I think really one of the strongest aspects of what we do, what we've been most successful in, is building capacity at the local level. And really the corner piece of this is what we call the Environmental Ambassador Program. And what we do in this program is we hire local residents. We bring them on for basically what amounts to be a year of training. And then we turn them loose in terms of data collection, in terms of design of scientific research, and also in terms of being advocates for conservation in their own and other communities. So these individuals are usually elected leaders of their own communities. They're people who've lived in the zone for a long time. They're people who are well respected. And I want to illustrate how this program works with one case study by Jorge Oliva, who's shown in this picture here with his family. So like a lot of other people, Jorge came to this area about 30 years ago. He cut down, this is a picture from his house. He cut down an area, a patch of forest. He used the wood that he cut down with a hand axe to construct a house. And he raised his family there, basically in a subsistence kind of way. He has a couple of livestock. He was cutting down forest for crops, and he was hunting to augment his diet. And that's a very typical pattern for residents that live in this area. And we brought Jorge on to work on the project about 11 years ago now. And in that time, he's really flourished as a scientific researcher. So he's learned all these different skills in terms of scientific research. But much more than that, more fundamentally than that, he has become a full collaborator in the scientific research that we do, in the sense that we have open conversations about trends that he has observed, about interesting or curious observations that he's had. We generate hypotheses together. We work together to generate methods to address those questions. He ends up collecting most of the data, and I end up analyzing the data and writing it up for scientific publication with Jorge as a co-author. And we also disseminate the work that he does through presentations that he gives at scientific meetings, interviews that he gives with local press, etc., and also disseminate to local communities through the other role that he has as an environmental ambassador, which is traveling oftentimes with a PowerPoint presentation, a laptop computer, a little projector we have, and a generator, because these communities don't have power, and he hikes out there carrying a generator, which for those of you who don't know is pretty heavy, and gets out to these communities and gives these presentations, which are very well attended and really appreciated, because these communities oftentimes feel like they're sort of forgotten otherwise. So in that manner, through this program, we managed to take a few individuals and provide them with an economically viable alternative to ecologically unsustainable actions like hunting and land clearing, and also build skill sets and provide environmental education to local residents. And in Jorge's case, he was, in 2006, so a while ago now, he was awarded an international prize, a Local Conservation Hero Award, in recognition of his efforts. And something that was really exciting to me was in 2011, him and a few other environmental ambassadors, we were able to travel together to an International Ornithological Congress in Peru. And he was able to present his results. His talk was sandwiched between that of a professor and a graduate student, and he was talking to professors and an audience much like yourselves. And that was obviously enormously rewarding for him and also for me. So Jorge is somebody who has remained in the program for a long time now, for 11 years. We've also had individuals who've used this as a jumping off point to get a university degree in environmental engineering, or to get jobs with the Ministry of the Environment, working on environmental issues, etc. So this program has not touched a ton of people. We've had about only 8 individuals go through this program, but it's had a transformative effect on the lives of those 8 individuals. And we complement that environmental ambassador program with a bunch of other sort of capacity building things, including, I mentioned before, these honors thesis projects. We give, in Ecuador, students do an honors thesis, which is sort of halfway between an undergraduate honors thesis here and a master's. And we give these grants where they come and they spend a year integrating with our research team, doing research, and then we seek to publish those findings with them. In a couple of cases, they've used that as a jumping board to go to graduate study in the U.S. And also professional training. So several individuals who've gone through that honors thesis program have then gone on to fill leadership roles within our project. Including the current president of a foundation that we started a couple of years ago, Fundación Conservación de los Andes Tropicales, or Foundation for the Conservation of the Tropical Andes, which is a legally recognized in-country NGO that's formed by the Ecuadorians who work on this project, and that we really see as a vehicle for them to move forward and really take more and more of an ownership role in this project. Okay, I'll just touch briefly on the other aspects of what we do down there. We do research, and again, with local residents as full collaborators, which has really been a win-win situation. And the kinds of research we do radio and satellite tracking of animals to see what their movements are like and how that affects their ecological roles as seed dispersal agents, what the consequences are for the plants. We do focused studies on endangered species, like this guy right here, the abandoned ground cuckoo, one of whose closest relatives is the roadrunner here in the United States. It's a purely terrestrial bird that has really only been seen a handful of times in Ecuador, a very poorly known bird that we've done basic descriptive work on. And we also look at patterns of diversity and abundance, like how does deforestation, how does the formation of forest fragments affect communities of birds or communities of frogs, and what are the consequences for abundance and diversity. That's the kind of work that we do in terms of research. And the research and the capacity building that we do, it really fits nicely in with education work that we do. So we've been working with 15 communities for 8 consecutive years now. And we have a whole education program where we provide training to teachers of these local schools. We have a workshop once a month where teachers come to this workshop and get syllabus, get syllabi, get teaching aids, get toys or games that they can help to reinforce those lesson plans. And that helps them to teach environmental education in their own classrooms. So we came in, when we started doing this work a few years ago, it was the case that the majority of students in these classrooms could not identify Ecuador on a map of the world. They could not identify where they live in a map of Ecuador. They didn't know very much about ecology, about conservation, etc. And we've helped to fill that gap using the theory that with increased appreciation and understanding will come a desire to conserve. And we've certainly seen that among the kids. We also provide technical workshops to adults. We have yearly environmental fairs that we put on where we bring together individuals from these communities. And more recently, I've also started to integrate this with my teaching at the university level. So just this past summer, I took a course of Tulane undergrads down to Ecuador for a 2-week-long field course where we visited a number of different field stations. And what we did on this course that I think was really beneficial for all parties involved is that we had 8 undergrads from Tulane, and then we had 6 Ecuadorian environmental ambassadors who came and were fully integrated on the course throughout all the places that we went. And the students and the Ecuadorians together designed and implemented these independent research projects at each site that we went to. And there was a language barrier in some cases, but people learned how to communicate with each other, overcame that, and I think on both sides it was a positive experience. And finally, the last element of what we do, or what we try to do down in Ecuador, is economic sustainability, which is obviously a fundamental piece of the puzzle. And we've been successful in some ways with this. We've been very effective at serving as a bridge between the government and local residents. There's not a lot of dialogue between those two actors, but we've helped to bring them to the table to talk about issues. We've also done some work related to cacao and tourism development, and some work related to nutrition and agriculture in a grassroots management plan. But this, as I'll talk about in a minute, is one area where our work has been less effective and less impactful than in the other areas. So about 10 years in now, a little bit more on this project, my appraisal of the situation is that we have developed a successful model for capacity building, for research and education, and it's a model in which those different elements are mutually reinforcing. So the capacity building feeds to the research, which feeds to the education, which feeds back to the capacity building. There's strong linkages between all those. And we have seen market changes in attitudes and actions of local residents. So we are seeing changes, although I must say, one thing that I really wish that I had done at the beginning of this program is to do a better job of quantifying how the situation was at the beginning. We didn't do that, and it's, we only have sort of qualitative measures of that. However, one area that we continue to lag in is sustainable development. We can talk about why that is. There's a few good reasons, the main one being that sustainable development is hard to do. And fundraising and also scaling up also remain constant challenges for this type of work. So that's a summary of the program that we have down in Ecuador. And what I want to do with just the last couple slides that I have here is to just talk a little bit more broadly, mainly in some ways for the benefit of the students who are in this class who are thinking about trying to take on this kind of work. Obviously the details will be different, but this type of engaged community-based work. As I was putting together this talk, I tried to think about what are the things that may have contributed to whatever successes we've had in this, and what are the things that make it more difficult. And I think that the most important thing really is personal values, for you to personally really believe in what you're doing, because it takes sacrifices to do this kind of work. So you have to really, it has to be something that gets you up out of bed in the morning and that is really kind of fundamental to who you are. But then given that you have that trait or that motivation, what are the things that you can do or that need to be done to make projects like this successful? I think the first one is to realize that it takes time to develop these kind of programs, because you really need to have strong relationships with local residents, and you need to have a good understanding of what's going on the ground there. So it's not the kind of thing that you can go down for 3 months and make it happen. I mean, there may be some cases where you can, but in general, it really takes a long-term commitment. And in my case, I was fortunate in this postdoc that I did to be able to live for 5 years out in Ecuador, which gave me enough time to form these relationships that even though I haven't lived in Ecuador for 7 years, I still have strong enough relationships with these individuals that we form a cohesive and coherent team that's sticking together. And kind of related to that, a second point, I think, is that it's really important in this kind of work to identify local residents who can really take the ball and run with it. Because you, as an outsider, you're going to be limited. I mean, even if you devote your whole life to it and you live down there, you're going to be limited in terms of what you can do. There's cultural barriers, and realistically, as time goes on, the best thing that you can do is start to remove yourself from the project and have it run without you. And that really depends upon identifying local leaders and empowering them. It also takes a long-term commitment. So, it's something you have to invest a lot of time in to start with, and then to really make the difference, you need to stick with it for a long time, for years or maybe your whole career. And for me personally, I've really benefited from mentorship, like for instance that professor I mentioned, Tom Smith, who funded me to go down there and has continued to be a strong ally. Mentorship and institutional support is nice when you can get it. And then in my own case, what's allowed me to be successful up to this point in blending this kind of work with a tenure track university position is that I have a model where the one hand feeds the other. So the capacity building and the training work that I do leads to highly motivated, highly capable residents who are gathering data that I can use to get grants from the NSF or to write scientific publications and then I can use those scientific publications and grants and body of work as rationale to attract more funding to do more capacity building, and the one hand feeds the other. And that's not the case in all disciplines or all cases, but I've been lucky in this case that that's worked out. So, using that as a bridge to talk about to revisit this question that we raised at the beginning of the talk, what is the role of the university in today's society? I mean, I think that this is probably material that many of you are familiar with, but I strongly feel that there need not be any dichotomy between basic or pure and applied knowledge or research. I think that that dichotomy is a false dichotomy, and that I think that in fact one feeds into the other in ways that it's almost always the case that the two are linked, or that there's not really only basic or only applied research, but somewhere in between. And also, again, that engagement and community-based work can engage the quality of the scholarship that you do. That's definitely the case for me. And it's not just the case that I'm working with somebody who knows the forest really well and they're able to, hear some bird that I can't hear. It goes much farther than that to really get to hypothesis formation, to thinking about the questions that we address. Because these individuals, because of the training that they've received and their involvement in the research after so many years, they get it. They are well versed in ecological theory and evolutionary theory, and they understand not just sort of natural history observations, but they understand how to get those into questions. So a lot of the scientific papers that I have today, they arose from conversations and from ideas that were from these local residents, or at least in collaboration. And for that reason, talking about universities a little, I think that it's really one fundamental thing that I think is the grand challenge right now in terms of bringing universities around to realize their full potential in terms of community engagement, is to recognize this sort of activity in the promotion and tenure decision. So that somebody who is going up for tenure and investing their time and energy in this kind of work can feel reasonably confident that it's going to be recognized and that they're going to get benefits and recognition for it, which is certainly not the case in most universities today. And there's certainly some challenging questions related to reforming the promotion and tenure decision, including, what does the relationship between engagement and scholarly performance need to be? How can we define scholarly achievement? Can we expand the breadth of that beyond, peer-reviewed publications and grants and books to other sorts of products? And I certainly don't know what the answer to these questions are. It's a challenging issue, and I don't think there's any single answer for any, that applies to all universities or even to all, cases. But it's something that I do think we need to resolve if it's going to move forward. And the last slide that I have here is just a short case study on what's happening at Tulane University, where I'm housed, which is a university that made a decision coming out of Hurricane Katrina about 8 years ago to brand itself as an engaged university. And if you look at the mission statement, if you look at the way that they present themselves, that the university presents itself, engagement is really fundamental to the core mission statement. And this has come in large part from the president that we have, Scott Cowan, and the provost, who've really bought into to community service and engaged learning. And as a result, we've seen some real changes in the composition of the university. One change is that we have the applicant pool, the number and the quality of the applicants that we've had at Tulane has just skyrocketed as a result of this. We've attracted really good students who are really committed to this. And as a result, we have a situation where at the top leadership levels, you have a commitment to engaged learning and community engagement. At the bottom level coming up, you have that same commitment among the students. But in the middle, and particularly among the more senior faculty, there's a lot of ambivalence or even resentment, active resentment towards something that they feel has been imposed upon them from above, and something that they feel philosophically in many cases is not the mission of the university, a different model, a different understanding. So it's an interesting place, and it's going to be really interesting to see how things play out as that middle, I think, increasingly gets squeezed. And my perspective as a faculty member there's some great strengths with centers and workshops and incentives to engage in this work. But at the same time, it's kind of schizophrenic because I get a lot of props from top-level leadership and a lot of props from students, but I know that the individuals who are sitting on the promotion and tenure committee don't really appreciate this kind of work. I mean, it's just a fact. So it's a challenging sort of landscape to negotiate. And with that, I'd just like to close by acknowledging first and foremost the team members from Ecuador that I work with, my collaborators and mentors, also my funding sources, or our funding sources, and finally Linda and the Sustainable Solutions Initiative for having me here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? Lots of interesting kinds of things. I was kind of watching, there were a lot of heads. There was some we're fortunate we have a little bit of time to ask a couple of questions, and it would be great if you could just say who you are, because I'm sure there's somebody else here who would like to follow up with you, and they may not know you and may not know what your name is or what program you're from. And it would be great to start out hearing from some students. Oh, no questions.
My name is Bria Zalowski. I'm a second-year PhD student. I'm just wondering what the process was like for you to try to identify the leaders, especially for your ambassador program. How did you go about identifying people that you thought would be most influential and the most respected?
And you may need to repeat it so everybody can hear that.
Yeah, the question was how do we go about identifying the people who would be suitable and leaders for the Environmental Ambassador Program. And the truth is that, I had been working there for almost a year before I hired the first person to serve in that role. And for that reason, I had some relationships already. I was able to ask people who would be well suited. And once we got that first person, who was Jorge Olivo, the guy who ended up winning that prize, first of all, it's not like I envisioned the Environmental Ambassador Program in its current state when I first brought him on. I just envisioned, getting local people involved. I hadn't really thought it out that well, to be honest. But it's a reflection on his and the other individuals involved in the project. They really they created that position. They made it happen. And once we had one person who was good, they were able to help identify other people. And then, like I said, we also targeted individuals who had been elected as leaders in their own communities, because that seemed to indicate that they would be well suited for that.
Krista Capps, I'm a postdoc with SSI. So I think something that's challenging a lot of people in the room is as the funding sources come to an end and you've built these really strong community relationships, it can be exceptionally difficult to convey that funding is ending and you don't know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And especially with paying people salaries, even though it's probably exceptionally minimal, how have you negotiated those challenges, explaining and conveying that type of relationship? And how have you overcome challenges associated with that? I think that's a really horrible, long question.
That's a great question, and it's really fundamental to what we do. So the question is, how do we deal with uncertainties in funding, and the fact that, as is the case in our project, oftentimes our funding horizon is 3 months or 6 months, and we don't have solid funding after that. How do we deal with that? And there's two different reasons. Two different answers. One is that with the core crew that we work with, the people who are full-time members of our crew and now of this foundation, we really try to explain to them what the situation is, and we've been fortunate to always be able to maintain salary for core individuals. Although there's definitely been times that have been pretty sketchy, and there's been times that I've had to effectively borrow money or dip into my startup funds, hope you're not watching out there. They wouldn't be too happy about that. So we've been lucky to make that happen. But I mean, another and a really common mistake that I certainly have made is, you go to an area and you see this schoolhouse that's falling down and they don't have any books, and you say, I'm going to go and I'm going to try to get a grant to get some books for your school. And then you go and you write the grant and you don't get it. But what people back there heard is, I'm going to get some books for your school. They didn't hear the grant part. So I think it's very, very important, and this is just a mistake that's made over and over again. It's very important to make it clear that that you're constrained by funding that you can bring in, and you'll do your best to get the funding, but that it's not up to you. It really depends on that, because it is really an issue. Question.
I'm Christine Luana. I'm also a postdoc here in SSI. I'm just curious, back 10 years ago when you were starting as a postdoc yourself, what were some of the biggest barriers kind of within the local community for getting this kind of project started? Was it cultural? Was it economic? I was kind of wondering, what were some of those big roadblocks that you had getting started?
Good question. The question was, what were the main roadblocks as we were initiating the project? And again, it's important to underscore again that the project evolved over time. So it took a few years for it to get to where it is right now. But the main challenge that I faced early on was that the local residents that we work with have a formal education that ended at about second or third grade. So the whole idea of standardized data collection was a challenge. The whole entering computer skills, entering it into Excel was a challenge, and just sort of the understanding that you need to take data in a repeatable way took a long time. So it ended up being a year that each individual would spend in the project getting training before we actually started using their data. And that gets back to the time commitment sort of thing. The things that made it easy were that it was were that the economic situation was such that just any infusion of cash was seen as something very desirable. So it didn't take a ton of money to pay a salary that was above what people would get as a normal day's working salary. Although something that's been a challenge more recently has been making the transition from paying people under the table to formalizing this NGO and paying people legally with taxes, and it basically doubled the amount that we have to pay for that person to get a certain amount in his pocket or her pocket. So. Question?
Hi, Cindy Eisenhower, Anthropology. This is great work, and I think you should really be commended for some neat things that you've done. But the one piece of this that's really missing for me are the politics. So I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about the legal status of these people within this absolute reserve, and what types of rights they have to resources for economic development in this context, and maybe even before the establishment of the reserve.
Great question. The question was, how do the people who live in this reserve, how are they constrained or not by legal policies involved with living in a reserve? And that is the reason I kind of alluded to that obliquely when I said that we serve as a bridge between the Ministry of the Environment and the local residents, because there's a lot of animosity among the local residents towards local residents. From local residents towards the ministry. Because what's happened is there have been, in the reserve, de facto, the way things are run, you can cut down forest, but you can't sell the wood. So that you can't get income from selling lumber. But people cut down the forest and it just sits there unless they try to sell it illegally. It sits there, and then they just kind of burn it and wait for it to go away, and then they grow crops on top of it, which is kind of even more tragic than. So they have animosity because they feel like it's limited their economic possibilities without providing them really any sort of benefit. And I think that that's a pretty legitimate point of view. And another, and even more fundamentally important point of consideration is that there's a huge amount of uncertainty about land tenure because of the establishment of the reserve. So it's not clear who the land really belongs to. And that has devalued their properties because they can't really sell it, and it's disincentivized them to conserve because they're like, well, if I die and then the land's going to pass over to the government instead of to my kids, then I should milk it for all it's worth while I'm alive. And those issues are slowly being resolved, and they're really fundamentally important issues. And similarly, the economic development issues which are related to those are fundamentally important. And that's an area where we just haven't gotten yet. But that we hope to, either within our own foundation or maybe more realistically by joining forces with groups that have expertise in those fields.
I know there are many more questions, but also that I know some people need to go. So we've come to the end of our formal time, but you'll answer some questions for a little bit?
I will.
If they want to come up. And can we give Jordan another hand?